fierce Ukrainian counterattack takes ground in Bakhmut. 𝗗𝗘𝗗 claims betrayal. A fierce Ukrainian counterattack in the Bakhmut sector destroyed Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, killing as many as 500 soldiers from the Wagner mercenary group in the worst tactical defeat suffered by the Kremlin's forces in months. In tough, close infighting, soldiers from Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade, backed by T-64 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers, wiped out a chain of Russian defensive positions to the southwest of Bakhmut, advancing Ukrainian-controlled territory to the 𝗗𝗘𝗘𝗗 River, according to statements from the Wagner Group's commander 𝗗𝗑𝗘𝗘𝗗 𝗗𝗘𝗃 and Ukrainian military sources. 𝗗𝗃𝗃, in an angry Tuesday evening video address, accused the 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade, a regular Russian army infantry unit holding positions in the area, of abandoning fortifications, thereby allowing attacking Ukrainian units to outflank his group's positions. Wagner lost 500 men, 𝗗𝗃𝗃𝗃 claimed, as a result of a powerful Ukrainian assault and the men of the 72nd's unwillingness to fight to hold their ground. In a single day's fighting on Tuesday, Russian forces in the Bakhmut sector were forced to abandon a battle space 2 kilometers deep and 6 kilometers long, 𝗗𝗃𝗃𝗃 said. If confirmed, it would be the most significant turnover of military real estate in 6 months of battles in Bakhmut, where the Russian military has struggled to advance more than a few dozen meters in a typical fighting day. Multiple sources linked with 3rd Assault Brigade, a former territorial defense unit raised in Kyiv from elements of the Azov Regiment in the early days of the war, and now a veteran armed forces of Ukraine. 𝗗𝗃𝗃 attack unit confirmed most details of 𝗗𝗃𝗃𝗃's claims. Drone video published by Azov's media section showed well-equipped troopers aboard made Vietnam-era M113 armored personnel carriers charging up to flattened Russian defensive positions, debarking, and executing textbook fire, movement assaults backed by automatic weapons fire and hand grenades. One unit spokesman claimed 2 companies from 72nd Infantry, usually between 200-300 men, were wiped out. Multiple sources said the 3rd Assault Brigade's attack captured combat vehicles and prisoners. According to a unit statement, at least 64 Russian soldiers died in the assault, but casualty counts were not complete. Azov Battalion founder Andriy Beletsky said the amount of Russian equipment and soldiers taken into custody by the Ukrainians was significant. 𝗗𝗃𝗃𝗃 tanks were shown firing on Russian positions at point-blank range, and infantrymen from the 3rd Assault Brigade moving through Russian positions past corpses. Some individual soldier posts showed corpses, with identification and name tags linking the body to a Russian paratrooper unit. The 3rd Assault Brigade is a veteran formation with long experience on the front line. On Wednesday evening, commander of Ukrainian ground forces Oleksandr Syrskyi also said Russian troops had fallen back in some regions of the front in the eastern Donetsk region by up to 2 kilometers, around 1 mile. We are seeing the results of the effective actions of our units, Syrskyi said, explaining that his forces were launching counterattacks along some portions of the contact line around Bakhmut. In some areas of the front, the enemy could not withstand the onslaught of Ukrainian defenders and retreated to a distance of up to 2 kilometers, he added. Kremlin military leadership in November declared Bakhmut a critical intermediate objective for its then still functioning plan to take over Ukraine's Donetsk region and annex it. In the following months, a carousel of 𝗗𝗃𝗃𝗃 units has rotated in and out of Bakhmut to contest Russian attacks in bitter, often house-to-house fighting. Ukrainian military social media has identified, along with the 3rd Assault, elements of the 𝗗𝗃𝗃's 5th Assault, 92nd Mechanized Presidential Guards, 79th and 80th Airborne Assault Brigades, as well as detachments from the Kharkiv Region Territorial Defense Battalions, all holding portions of the Bakhmut perimeter. White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby on May 1 told reporters the U.S. estimates Russia has lost as many as 100,000 men in largely failed attacks in the past 5 months, the lion's share of them suffered by the Wagner mercenary group in Bakhmut. The 𝗗𝗘𝗘𝗗's counterattack at Bakhmut was likely the most decisive Ukrainian battlefield success since late January and early February, when a pair of Russian Marine brigades, heavily reinforced with tanks, attacked positions held by the 𝗗𝗘𝗄's 72nd Mechanized Infantry Brigade in the city of 𝗗𝗜𝗘𝗗. The Russian forces hit dense minefields and were gutted by concentrated artillery strikes. Pro-Ukraine border raid exposes Russian defenses and divisions. The Belgorod attack could deal a further blow to the Kremlin standing at home and potentially leave its troops stretched in Ukraine, military observers said. A cross-border incursion into Russia from Ukraine sparked days of chaotic fighting that have fueled new disquiet about the Kremlin's ability to defend its territory without leaving its military exposed on the front lines. Moscow said Wednesday it had successfully fought off the assault in the border region of Belgorod, but not before drone attacks and fighters on the ground did damage to homes and infrastructure while forcing thousands of residents to evacuate. Though it appeared to achieve little militarily, the operation raised awkward questions for Russian President Vladimir Putin 15 months into his invasion. It could deal a further blow to the Kremlin standing at home and potentially leave its troops stretched in Ukraine as it scrambles to respond, according to prominent Russian military voices and Western military analysts. The attacker's identity is contested. Ukraine said that the raid was carried out by Russian citizens who independently rose up against the Putin regime. Russia has called them Ukrainian saboteurs, and two groups with far-right ties claiming to be Russians fighting on behalf of Ukraine have said they were responsible. In any case, the attack has illustrated the ease with which pro-Ukrainian fighters can cause trouble for the Kremlin as its long-anticipated counteroffensive gets underway. The cross-border raid shows that Russia's security, once bolstered by a formidable military machine, had declined markedly since last year's invasion, said Sergei Radchenko, an expert on international relations at Johns Hopkins University. This is why the Ukrainian intelligence bothers with operations that don't really have any other meaning, to show the weakness of the Russian state. That's the message that's being sent, he told NBC News. The results of Putin's disastrous invasion speak for itself. Russia is a lot less safe and a lot less capable, Radchenko added. He said the drone attack on the Kremlin on May 3, which Moscow immediately called an Ukrainian assassination attempt on Putin, a charge denied by Kyiv, similarly showed the vulnerabilities of the state. In an apparent effort to display the strength of its response, a video shared widely on Russian social media and geolocated by NBC News showed a senior general leading the operation to rebuff the incursion earlier this week, directing troops in military fatigues and urging them to move forward on a road in a residential area near the border. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu called a news conference Wednesday that the pro-Ukrainian fighters were thrown back to the territory of Ukraine, where they continued to be defeated until they were completely eliminated. He promised to react promptly and extremely harshly to any future cross-border raids. But the Kremlin's response was met with ridicule by supporters of Ukraine and dismay by its own influential pro-military figures. In a sign that Russia's recent claim of a symbolic prize on the battlefield had done little to ease internal dissent, the mercenary chief who led that campaign in Bakhmut also issued a warning. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner mercenary group, voiced fears Wednesday that Russia could not just lose the war, but also face a revolution similar to those of 1917, unless the country's ruling elite intensified its approach. "We need to impose martial law," said Prigozhin, who has been a vocal critic of Moscow's military leaders. Igor Girkin, who gained notoriety as one of the main leaders of Russia's initial efforts in eastern Ukraine back in 2014, wrote on Telegram on Wednesday that the incursion would lead to the inevitable creation of a continuous front along this border and force the redeployment of Russian troops away from other areas. Summing up the despondency of several other commentators, he added that this could give the Ukrainian army a crucial advantage as it plans a broad operation to seize back occupied land. This really shows that Russia's borders are extremely vulnerable, and that Ukraine cannot just launch attacks from a distance on infrastructure in occupied Crimea or in Luhansk, but coordinate that with a kind of proxy ground war operation, said Samuel Romani, an expert in Russia's military operations at the University of Oxford. This is a significant event, he added, But analysts cautioned that despite the signs of discontent, the cross-border raid could also play into the hands of the Russian leadership and its propaganda goals, not least since the attackers have shared neo-Nazi views and appeared to use American armored vehicles. Russian propagandists are talking about how this sabotage operation was successfully foiled, and they can use this to stoke fears about Russia being vulnerable to a Western proxy war and the threat of the disintegration of Russia that Putin and others keep spinning, Ramani said. This could rally people around the flag. Radchenko agreed. This could backfire. It gives credit to the notion that Russia is being invaded from the outside, and it could translate into greater public support. So I'd be cautious in celebrating this idea. How is Russian Federation hiding colossal casualty figures from the war in Ukraine? How have the figures for casualties resulting from its military action in Ukraine affected Russian demographics, and how are the authorities hiding them? The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on Thursday, May 25, gave a figure for the number of Russian soldiers killed during Putin's illegal invasion as being 205,260. How true is this information? The only casualty figures currently available to Russians are those produced by Ukrainian official sources. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has not released any reports on Russian army losses since September 2022, when he gave a figure of 5,937 deaths. In early May, the U.S. National Security Council Strategic Communications Coordinator John Kirby said that in 2023 alone, Russia had lost 100,000 soldiers killed or wounded. In response, on May 2, Russian Presidential Secretary Dmitry Peskov said that the information was taken from the ceiling. The United States does not have verified data. He also added that it is necessary to focus only on those figures that the Russian Defense Ministry publishes. Perhaps more critical than the total high level of losses of regular soldiers and those from private military companies is the influence they are having on demographic indicators of the country. For example, the Russian publication Media Zona, together with the BBC and a team of volunteers, maintains a list of those Russian soldiers who have died in the war, but only includes those whose deaths have been publicly reported. The Media Zona team assessed that casualties aged from 20 to 24, as confirmed in open sources, accounted for around a third of all deaths of Russian men in 2022. On May 15, 2023, Echo published an infographic where, based on what it saw as the underaccounting of military deaths, the share of military deaths for those aged 20-24 years actually represented approximately half of all deaths. In other words, every other Russian guy who died in the war. According to analysts, the high death rate on the territory of Ukraine indicates that there is a lack of modern, high-precision equipment being used by the army, contrary to that repeatedly reported by Sergei Shoigu. The publication Voynoye Bozriny reported on March 21 that in 2022, the Russian army was increasingly being supplied with 50 or 60 years old tanks removed from storage bases and transferred to the front line. Thus, faced with increasing supplies of the latest Western equipment given to well-trained units of the armed forces of Ukraine, the Russian army was relying on conscripts using more and more aging weapons, with a resulting increase in the damage to the human factor. This was exacerbated, according to media reports, by the poor quality of medical care available for Russian wounded, which also contributed to a much higher mortality rate. Ironically, the only leader who publicly points out the unacceptable level of human losses during military operations is the founder of the Wagner PMK, Yevgeny Prigozhin. He publicly decries the shortage of ammunition, which he says is compounded by Russian military units fleeing the battlefield and is contributing to the large number of deaths among his own units. While regular military officers, limited by discipline, do not have an opportunity to speak publicly, Prigozhin seems to have no such constraints. Russian President Vladimir Putin in May 2023 signed a decree to amend the law on the granting Russian citizenship to foreigners and stateless persons. According to these amendments, they and their families can now speedily obtain Russian citizenship simply by signing a contract for military service. At the same time, the document clarifies that it applies not only to those who have signed a contract with the Russian armed forces, but also to those who have signed a contract with some military formations. Experts are of the opinion that this is done in order to hide losses among the Russian military. Also, losses are hidden by providing false information about the cause of death of a particular person. One of the most popular ways is to designate a soldier as missing or as died by negligence. In addition, they also forge service documentation, with entries claiming retired from the army 2 weeks before his death. On January 11, during a government-level meeting, Putin publicly called for special attention to be given to problems in the field of demography. In May, the commander of the Chechen Special Detachment 𝗗𝗘𝗗𝗗 in his Telegram channel warned Russia that if they didn't start giving birth to more children, they would become an endangered people.